I was recently at a very inspiring speech by Charlie Angus, and he kept using the phrase fascist toolkit. So I dug into that a little bit. And guys, it doesn't look good. So this one's a little bit long, so just bear with me. We need to see the patterns. These are the early stage warning signs that history puts some big frickin' red flags on. It always starts out the same. Before anyone starts coming at me in the comments, I'm not saying Alberta is Nazi Germany or Russia or the United States under Trump, even though they probably want to be. However, fascist and authoritarian regimes do not start at the end. They start by changing the nature of power, and that's what this is all about. One of the most obvious warning signs is when the government begins to circumvent rights rather than stand behind its laws in court. We've been witness to these, the notwithstanding clause, a bunch of times. Bill 9, Bill 2, they've shut down any legal possibility of challenges. You don't do that unless you know you're violating someone's rights. It's legal, sure, but it should absolutely not be normalized. In early 1930s Germany, democratic institutions were not torn apart suddenly. Instead, legislation was enacted that made it legal to ignore rights when it was politically expedient. That's how the erosion of democracy happens. Not by violating the law, but by making exceptions to it the norm. Okay? Next up is professional independence. The Alberta government passed Bill 13. It restricts the ability of self-governing professional associations such as doctors, teachers, lawyers, vets. They can't govern themselves in terms of advocacy or public expression. This also prevents organizations from implementing mandatory trainings on things like cross-cultural understanding or equitable treatment or reducing bias. Conveniently, at the same time, the government is openly blaming immigrants for our failing health and education systems. This was justified by the government as a measure to safeguard freedom of speech. Professional organizations predict that it will impair self-governance, impact standards and public trust, open our most vulnerable populations up to potential harm, and impair political independence. In Putin's Russia, professionals don't have to be arrested to be silenced. They are coerced, stigmatized, or administratively restricted until it's no longer worthwhile for them to speak out. Authoritarian regimes don't abolish professionals. They domesticate and effectively silence them. Another fundamental instrument in the fascist toolbox is reducing oversight. Alberta did this with Bill 14. So they amended the process by which certain government decisions are reviewed and appealed, making it harder for people to appeal decisions. And this is precisely how the unconstitutional separatist citizen initiative made its way to the street, despite the courts already saying it's unconstitutional. In Alberta, oversight is just darn inconvenient, and we sure don't like inconvenience. This shows up in the United States during the second term of Trump in immigration enforcement. At a federal level, power increased, and so too did the reduction of independent oversight, and now there are multiple reports of citizens being dragged from their homes or their vehicles by unidentifiable masked men and taken away. Citizens have been shot in the street by immigration officers who have no jurisdiction over U.S. citizens. There's no justification, no due process, and no oversight. If it can happen there, it can happen here. This is about what happens when power is left without checks and balances. Here's one that most people missed. Bill 18. Alberta now requires certain public institutions to seek approval from the province before entering or renewing federal agreements. Let's change. Why would our province want to block federal money from coming in? I mean, they're always complaining about how we never get anything from the feds and, we give. But now institutions need to ask permission? In Russia, institutions operate at the pleasure of the state. You don't have to dissolve institutions if you can just make them your puppets. The scale is different, sure, but the idea is the same. Control the money and make them beg. Authoritarian states are also very nervous about local power. With Bill 20, Alberta took care of that. We increased the power of the province over cities. We just saw this in Calgary around their water issues. demanding all of the documentation for the last decade or more. I wonder who they'll blame that one on. Any bets it's their biggest competition? Cities are also where dissent is organized, and we don't like dissent. In early Nazi Germany, local governments were completely eliminated before the national government was fully in control. In modern Russia, the autonomy of cities was reduced to increase state power, because when local democracy is reduced, provincial power increases. And let's finish up with election laws. Bill 54. Alberta changed several election and participation laws, including banning electronic vote tabulators. Now, not only did this cost more, and it wasn't necessarily authoritarian, but when the law tips consistently towards distrust or friction or benefits the ruling party, that's something called authoritarian drift. Okay? Their desire to change the riding boundaries in ways that don't make sense, including bringing large swaths of rural voters into city ridings, would make it so no one's voice is really truly heard. It would also suggest the votes would lean to a more conservative outcome. Some people might consider that bordering on gerrymandering. In the United States, rule changes after an election have become an important means by which power is maintained without technically concluding an election. One law does not a fascist state make, but patterns do. Together, rights can be circumvented, professionals are constrained, oversight is impaired, institutions must seek permission, local democracy is reduced, and participation rules are transformed. History has a name for this pattern. It's not the end stage, it's the early warning system. Every authoritarian state claims it's a democracy right up until the point it stops being one. Or actually, I should say, right up until the point the people realize it stopped being one. Now, Alberta is still a democracy. I'm not arguing that fact, of course we are. That's why this recall exists. Recall is not revolutionary, it is a democratic emergency stop. So if these patterns trouble you, if you can see the logic in some of what I'm saying here, you should sign the recall. If you think power should have limits and oversight, then you should sign the recall, because our government has stopped listening. They are making us invisible, and this is one of the only tools we have left. Waiting until it's obvious means we've waited too long. It'll be too late. Democracy doesn't go out with a bang. There's no fireworks. It slips away quietly while we're still busy telling ourselves that it could never happen here.